About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Why did the United States attack Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen? Why are U.S. operatives helping to destabilize Syria? And why is the United States government so intent on taking down Iran, in spite of the fact that Iran has not attacked any country since 1798? And what's next? What are we headed for? When you look at the current trajectory that we're on, it doesn't make any sense at all if you evaluate it based on what we're taught in school. And it doesn't make any sense if you base your worldview on the propaganda that the mainstream media tries to pass off as news. But it makes perfect sense once you know the real motives of the powers that be. For some time now, Russia, China, Iran, and Syria have been in the crosshairs. Once you understand why, the events unfolding in the world right now will make much more sense. The US dollar is a truly unique currency. In fact, its current design and its relationship to geopolitics is unlike any other in history. Though it has been the world reserve currency since 1945, this is not what makes it unique. Many currencies have held their reserve status off and on over the centuries. But what makes the dollar unique is the fact that since the early 1970s it has been, with a few notable exceptions, the only currency used to buy and sell oil on the global market. Prior to 1971, the US dollar was bound to the gold standard, at least officially. According to the IMF, by 1966 foreign central banks held $14 billion in US dollars. However, the United States only had $3.2 billion in gold allocated to cover foreign holdings. Translation: the Federal Reserve was printing more money than it could actually back. The result was rampant inflation and a general flight from the dollar. In 1971, in what later came to be called the Nixon shock, President Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard completely.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
At this point, the dollar became a pure debt-based currency. With debt-based currencies, money is literally loaned into existence. Approximately 70% of the money in circulation is created by ordinary banks, which are allowed to loan out more money than they actually have in their accounts. The rest is created by the Federal Reserve, which loans out money that they don't have, mostly to government. It's kind of like writing hot checks, except it's legal for banks. This practice, which is referred to as fractional reserve banking, is supposedly regulated by the Federal Reserve, an institution which just happens to be owned and controlled by a conglomerate of banks. And no agency or branch of government regulates the Federal Reserve.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
Now, to make things even more interesting, these fractional reserve loans have interest attached, but the money to pay that interest doesn't exist in the system. As a result, there's always more total debt than there is money in circulation. And in order to stay afloat, the economy must grow perpetually. This is obviously not sustainable. Now, you might be wondering how the dollar has maintained such a dominant position on the world stage for over 40 years, if it's really little more than an elaborate Ponzi scheme. Well, this is where the dollar meets geopolitics. In 1973, under the shadow of the artificial OPEC crisis, the Nixon administration began secret negotiations with the government of Saudi Arabia to establish what later came to be referred to as the petrodollar recycling system. Under the arrangement, Saudis would only sell their oil in US dollars and would invest the majority of their excess profits into US banks and capital markets. The IMF would then use this money to facilitate loans to oil importers who were having difficulties covering the increase in oil prices. The interest and payments on these loans would of course be denominated in US dollars. This agreement was formalized in the US-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, put together by Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, in 1974. The system was expanded to include the rest of OPEC by 1975. Though presented as a buffer to the recessionary effects of rising oil prices, this arrangement had a hidden side effect. It removed the traditional restraints on US monetary policy. The Federal Reserve was now free to increase the money supply at will. The ever-increasing demand for oil would prevent a flight from the dollar, while distributing the inflationary consequences across the entire planet. The dollar went from being a gold-backed currency to an oil-backed currency. It also became America's primary export. Did you ever wonder how the US economy has been able to stay afloat while running multi-billion-dollar trade deficits for decades? Did you ever wonder how it is that the US holds such a disproportionate amount of the world's wealth when 70% of the US economy is consumer-based? In the modern era, fossil fuels make the world go round. They have become integrated into every aspect of civilization. Agriculture, transportation, plastics, heating, defense, medicine, and demand just keeps growing. As long as the world needs oil, and as long as oil is only sold in US dollars, there will be a demand for US dollars. And that demand is what gives the dollar its value. For the United States, this is a great deal. Dollars go out, either as paper or digits in a computer system, and real, tangible products and services come in. However, for the rest of the world, it's a very sneaky form of exploitation. Having global trade predominantly in dollars also provides Washington with a powerful financial weapon through sanctions. This is due to the fact that most large-scale dollar transactions are forced to pass through the US. This petrodollar system stood unchallenged until September of 2000, when Saddam Hussein announced his decision to switch Iraq's oil sales off of the dollar to euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar. The motive for these invasions and covert actions becomes clear when we look at them in their full context and connect the dots. Those who control the United States understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set off a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is absolutely nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. But rather than accepting the fact that the dollar is nearing the end of its lifespan, the powers that be have made a calculated gambit. They have decided to use the brute force of the US military to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. In November of 2000, Iraq began selling its oil exclusively in euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar and on US financial dominance, and it wasn't going to be tolerated. In response, the US government, with the assistance of the mainstream media, began to build up a massive propaganda campaign claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was planning to use them. In 2003, the US invaded, and once they had control of the country, oil sales were immediately switched back to dollars. This is particularly notable due to the fact that switching back to the dollar meant a 15 to 20% loss in revenue due to the euro's higher value. It doesn't make any sense at all unless you take the petrodollar into account. Let's take a look at the events of the past decade and see if you see a pattern. In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. US and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011, and after taking control of the region, US armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan central bank.
Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi. This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya, who now have the opportunity to determine their own destiny in a new and democratic Libya.
الشعب الذي قرر أن يعيش بكبرياء وأن يعيش حر وإلا يسمع نبكة جابية. المسكين سيراكوزي أفتح النزاع الليبية، لكن ننصحك داخل مهديات قبل لا تفتح النزاع الليبية، لأنك ستصعق حتما. أعصابك ضعيفة، ما تتحمل ما تراه في النزاع الليبية. تحدي الشعب الليبي، المظاهرة المليونية، لا تستطيع. أعصابك أنت.
According to some, it's about protecting civilians.
And our resolve is clear. The people of Libya must be protected.
Others say it's about oil.
The only reason they're interested with Libya is about the oil. You'd think we'd be in Iraq if the major export there was broccoli.
But some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically Gaddafi's plan to introduce the gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth.
It's one of these things that you have to plan almost in secret, because as soon as you say you're going to change over from the dollar to something else, you're going to be targeted.
He called on African and Muslim nations to join together to create this new currency that would rival the dollar and euro. They would sell oil and other resources around the world only for gold dinars.
If Gaddafi had an intent to try to reprice his oil or whatever else the country was selling in the global markets and accept something else as a currency, or maybe launch a gold dinar currency, any move such as that would certainly not be welcomed by the power elite today who are responsible for controlling the world's central banks. So yes, that would certainly be something that would cause his immediate dismissal and the need for other reasons to be brought forth for removing him from power.
It's happened before. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraqi oil would be traded in euros, not dollars. Sanctions and an invasion followed. Some say because the Americans were desperate to prevent OPEC from transferring oil trading in all its member countries to the euro. A gold dinar would have had serious consequences for the world financial system.
A warning on the streets of Tripoli.
I want to say to Al Jazeera, wake up, because you are in dreaming. No one can kill Muammar Gaddafi. All Libyan will Muammar Gaddafi.
We noticed that the administration or management of their channels selected what they want from these reports and eliminate or delete what does not serve their purposes.
Which is why people here are angry. Mohammed's taken a few days off from his work as an engineer to join the throngs of Gaddafi supporters in downtown Green Square.
They're hiding this. What's going on now, okay? All the people are here, just, of course, yes, just to be supportive for our leader, Muammar Gaddafi, okay? And they want to hide this.
Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the U.S. government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon.
Joining me now, the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. Good to see you, sir. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
That's a pretty aggressive call. I haven't heard anybody say that we should, right now, go in and bomb those camps. Are you?
Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements. The country is currently in the process of being destabilized with covert assistance from NATO. And though Russia and China have warned the United States not to get involved, the White House has made statements within the past month indicating that they are considering military intervention. It should be clear that military intervention in Syria and Iran isn't being considered. It's a foregone conclusion, just as it was in Iraq and Libya. The U.S. is actively working to create the context which gives them the diplomatic cover to do what they already have planned.
Good afternoon, everybody. 10 days ago, the world watched in horror as men, women, and children were massacred in Syria in the worst chemical weapons attack of the 21st century. Yesterday, the United States presented a powerful case that the Syrian government was responsible for this attack on its own people.
There is also very little doubt, and should be no doubt, for anyone who approaches this logically, that the Syrian regime is responsible for the use of chemical weapons on August 21st outside of Damascus.
All of them dead from Assad's gas.
After careful deliberation, I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets.
During our investigation for crimes against humanity and war crimes, we collect some witness testimony that made to appear that some chemical weapons were used, in particular nervine gas. And what appeared on to our investigation that was used by the opponents, by the rebels, and we have no indication at all that the government, Syria, the authority of the Syrian government, have used chemical weapons.
In February of 2014, this global chess game heated up in a new venue, Ukraine. The real target, however, was Russia. You see, Russia just happens to be the world's second largest oil exporter. And not only have they been a thorn in Washington's side diplomatically, but they also opened up an energy bourse in 2008 with sales denominated in rubles and gold. Russia has also been in the process of organizing a Eurasian Economic Union, which includes plans to adopt a common currency unit and which is slated to have its own independent energy market. Leading up to the crisis, Ukraine had been presented with a choice: either join the EU under an association agreement or join the Eurasian Union. The EU insisted that this was an either-or proposition. Ukraine couldn't join both. Russia, on the other hand, asserted that joining both posed no issue. President Yanukovych decided to go with Russia. In response, the US national security apparatus did what it does best. It toppled Yanukovych and installed a puppet government. To see the full evidence of Washington's involvement in the coup, watch the Ukraine crisis, which you're not being told. Though this all seemed to be going well at first, the US quickly lost control of the situation. Crimea held a referendum, and the people voted overwhelmingly to secede from Ukraine and reunify with Russia. The transition was orderly and peaceful. No one was killed. Yet the West immediately framed the entire event as an act of Russian aggression. And this became the go-to mantra from that point on.
Мы победили! Слава России!
Just hours after Russia's annexation of Crimea, a huge celebration on Red Square. The star guest, Vladimir Putin, condemned by the West, but at the height of his power and popularity here in Russia.
Я
We're for peace, this woman says. We're for Putin, we're for Crimea, and we're for Sevastopol. Vladimir Vladimirovich, we love you, another screams. We bow to you. And this man added, Crimea is ours, it's Russia's, and it's always been ours and always will be. Many hold signs welcoming Crimea, but to most, the annexation is also a victory over the West, a sign of a strong Russia with a strong leader.
Quickly, I want to talk about the Russian version of this video, because if you look at the creation, the timestamp of when it was created, okay, it was actually, as you can see here, it was actually created on July the 16th, and this event did not even occur till July the 17th, okay? So that's a major discrepancy in the story. So obviously this is proof that this video, this supposed evidence implicating Russia in the whole situation was fabricated.
All sorts of conjecture, and not once have any facts been presented to us. There have been reports that there are photographs from space showing movements of Russian troops. But as it turned out, it was computer games and the images were taken from there. And the latest allegations are more or less of the same kind.
And I would like to introduce you some dates on air situation in the area of Donetsk for that day. Why did the combat aircraft flew the same airline with the civil aviation and simultaneously and the same flight level?
Хотелось бы получить ответ на этот вопрос.
We would like to find the answer for this question.
Sanctions have merely pushed Russia and China into closer cooperation and have accelerated Russia's de-dollarization agenda. And in spite of the rhetoric, this has not led to Russia being isolated. The US and NATO have put a wedge between themselves and Russia, but not between Russia and the rest of the world. This new anti-dollar axis goes deeper than economics. These countries understand what's at stake here. This is why in the wake of the Ukrainian crisis, China has proposed a new Eurasian Security Pact, which would include Russia and Iran. Consider the implications here as the Obama administration begins bombing in Syria, which also has a mutual defense agreement with Iran. This is not the Cold War 2.0. This is World War 3.0. The masses may not have figured it out yet, but history will remember it that way. Alliances are solidifying and hot wars are underway on multiple fronts. If the provocations and proxy wars continue, it's only a matter of time before the big players confront each other directly, and that is a recipe for disaster. Does all of this sound insane to you? Oh, you're right. The people running the world right now are insane. But what you need to understand is that this is not going to end with Iran. China and Russia have stated publicly and on no uncertain terms that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. Iran is one of their key allies, one of the last independent oil producers in the region, and they understand that if Iran falls, then they will have no way to escape the dollar without going to war. And yet the United States is pushing forward in spite of the warnings. What we are witnessing here is a trajectory that leads straight to the unthinkable. It's a trajectory that was mapped out years ago in full awareness of the human consequences. But who was it that put us on this course? What kind of psychopath is willing to intentionally set off a global conflict that will lead to millions of deaths just to protect the value of a paper currency? It obviously isn't the president. The decision to invade Libya, Syria, and Iran was made long before Obama had risen to the national spotlight. And yet, he's carrying out his duty just like the puppets that preceded him. So who is it that pulls the strings? Often the best answer to questions like this are found by asking another question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Obviously those who have the power to print the dollar out of thin air have the most to lose if the dollar were to fall. And since 1913, that power has been held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private entity owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful banks in the world. And the men who control those banks are the ones who pull the strings. To them, this is just a game. Your life and the lives of those you love are just pawns on their chessboard. And like a spoiled 4-year-old who tips the board onto the floor when they start to lose, the powers that be are willing to start World War III to keep control of the global financial system.
The Kremlin's media czar on Russian state TV has threatened the United States with a nuclear strike. In his news broadcast,
I hope everyone understands that it's better not to mess
with Russia. I have to remind you that Russia is a nuclear superpower.
And Russia has warned that thermonuclear war could result if the U.S. continues down this path.
China's military budget will grow by about 10% in the coming year. The So how much time do we have left? It's a question I hear constantly, but it's the wrong question. Asking how much time we have left is a passive posture. It's the attitude of a prisoner who's waiting to be taken out to a ditch and shot in the back of the head. What are our chances? Can we change course? Also the wrong question. The odds don't matter anymore. If you understand what we're facing, then you have a moral responsibility to do everything in your power to alter the course that we're on, regardless of the odds. It's only when you stop basing your involvement on the chances of success that success actually becomes possible. To strip the ill-begotten power from the financial elites and to bring these criminal cartels to justice will require nothing less than a revolution. The government is not going to save us. The government is completely infiltrated and corrupt to the core. Looking to them for a solution at this point is utterly naive. There are 3 stages of revolution, and they are sequential. Stage 1 is already underway. Stage 1 is the ideological resistance. In this stage, we have to actively work to wake up as many people as possible about what is happening and the direction we're headed. All revolutions originate from a shift in the mindset of the population, and no other meaningful resistance is possible without it. Success in this stage of the game can be measured by the contagion of ideas. When an idea reaches critical mass, it begins to spread on its own and seeps into all levels of society. In order to achieve that contagion, we need more people in this fight. We need more people speaking out, making videos, writing articles, getting this information onto the national and international stage. And we especially need to reach the police and the military. Stage 2 is civil disobedience, also known as nonviolent resistance. In this stage, you put your money where your mouth is, or more accurately, you withhold your money and your obedience from the government, and you do everything in your power to bring the gears of the state to a halt. Practiced in mass, this method alone is often enough to bring a regime to its knees. However, if you fail at this stage, stage 3 is inevitable. Stage 3 is direct physical resistance. Direct physical resistance is the last resort, and it should be avoided and delayed as long as possible, and it should only be invoked after all other options have been thoroughly exhausted. There are those who talk tough and claim that they will resist when the time comes, but what those people fail to realize is that if you are inactive during the first 2 stages and save your efforts for the last resistance, then you will fail. When the Nazis were moving door to door, dragging people out of their homes in Germany, that was the time to fight back physically. But due to the lack of ideological resistance and civil disobedience leading up to that moment, even an armed uprising would have likely failed at that point. An armed uprising can only succeed if the people have established an attitude of active resistance. And active resistance is only possible after their minds have broken free from the mainstream propaganda. If you want to fight back, it's now or never. You're not going to get another chance, and the stakes are far higher than they were in Nazi